On a canal side near Northwich in February last year, two very unusual narrowboats had moored. Their names should be familiar to long-time viewers of this channel. Dan, walking up the towpath, owns Emily Ann. Matthew, aboard Emily Ann, owns Tixall, and both narrowboats are steam-driven. The pair have joined forces for a major undertaking on each boat. The boilers need to come out for refurbishment.
This couldn't be done in the boat, there wasn't enough room. But all of the lagging, the insulation and things like that had to be taken off as well. It's easier to just do it and work on it outside of the boat. And also the boiler examiner can get round, inspect all of the welds, even the welds at the bottom of the boiler which you just can't access at the moment. Crack test all of those, thickness test all of the platework, every single little piece. It can inspect all the tube holes with the boiler out, see if there's any nicks that he's not very happy with. Literally everything. So if you're doing a heavy general overhaul on a boat's boiler, usually the boiler comes out of the boat.
And this is a rather bigger job than taking out a conventional diesel engine, with the boiler being so large that a special hatch is fitted in the roof to let the boiler be lifted out by a crane.
We removed the hatch first, we disconnected all the pipe work within a few hours. Once the boiler is free, we then could disconnect it from the hull. There's 3 bolts which keep it secured to the hull and steady. They're the last thing that we remove. Once that's good, the roof's out of the way, the engine room roof, the boiler is then ready to lift out of the boat.
It is all a slow and heavy process, but with the hatch off, the boiler is revealed, and you can see the tubes through which the heat from the fire turns the water to steam. Once the boiler is out, the plan is to replace all those tubes.
They don't last as long as the actual boiler shell itself. Hot gases go through these tubes, very high in sulphur. They can rot the tubes from the outside in. You've also got impurities in the boiler that can attack certain bits of the tubes. This is where you get pit holes and things like that. Now, Emily Ann and Tixall's boiler were in roughly about the same time. We don't know what these tubes look like. It's been 20 years. It's a long time for tubes to be in the boiler, so I think it's time to take them out. When the tubes are out, we can look at the boiler shell, we can thickness test everything else, we can check all the welds on the boiler, and then we've got a sound peace of mind that basically says we've now got tubes in that will probably last us another 20 years.
With the hatch to Tixall's boiler removed, the chaps must now do the same for Emily Ann. It's a process which begins by taking off the rather large chimney using some traditional canal boat engineering techniques. In other words, hitting it gently and waggling it until it comes off.
Since we put decent bushes in it, it's a lot tighter fit now.
Peering down the hole shows the boiler waiting below. The hatch lifts off, and there's the guts of the beast, the engine under wraps and the boiler now needing to be freed from its mountings, ready for the lift out. To start with, a bit of a clean-up of the ash pan, so that dirt doesn't get thrown everywhere later on. At this point, things went a bit downhill, as inside the boiler, a metal plate above the fire needed to be removed, which Dan attempted by pulling on it with a rope through the tubes. Alas, the plate was not so keen on coming out.
So you were saying hopefully this will lift up?
Yeah, I think leverage is required on that. That's well stuck, isn't it?
Some persuasion.
I mentioned classic narrowboat engineering techniques a moment ago. Well, it's time for another. Brute force and a long lever. The plan was to lift the plate with the plank of wood pivoted off the boiler top to give enough force. The bangometer also came back into play at this point.
Do you want me to tap it with an hammer while you're pulling?
Yeah,
Yeah.
probably do.
This went on for rather a long time, but at last Dan was able to free the offending item. Now for the small matter of moving the boats from where they'd moored the prior night up to the slipway at the wharf where the crane was. And because the boiler was now disconnected, obviously the steam engine couldn't run, so that meant bow hauling both boats the couple of hundred yards along the canal. If you're wondering why they didn't moor a bit closer, it's because this was the closest they could get without becoming an obstruction on the canal. And once the boats get moving, they're actually not that hard to pull. The trickiest bit is when you have to move them past other boats. Again, Matthew was ready for this, with a long pole guiding the bow rope and no need to disturb or go aboard the other boats.
Yeah, so walkies.
The irony of coal being for sale here at the one time they couldn't light the boiler was not lost on us. Just under that bridge is where the wharf is. At this point, a long pole was used to punt the back of the boat over to the dockside so that it could be slid gently into the craneage space. This massive boat lift, which normally hauls entire narrowboats out of the canal for maintenance, would be used to raise the boilers. Of course, the boilers then need to be taken away for their maintenance, so Matthew had brought his tractor and trailer to load them onto. I don't know much about tractors, but you've got to say that is a fine-looking vintage machine. Inside Tixall, the final bolts were removed from the bottom of the boiler, and a chain attached to the lifting eye bolt on top. Gently, 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 the hook on the crane was moved to connect with the chain on the boiler. Double looped and secured, the lift could begin, very slowly. At last it was free and dangling above the boat. The crane could then inch forward on its massive wheels to place the boiler safely on the trailer. The boiler might be solid metal, but it's still a delicate process to lower it down, not least because they needed to leave space for the other boiler from Emily Ann. One down, one to go. And just a forlorn empty space in Tixall where the boiler used to sit. Now for Emily Ann, and immediately a problem, as the deeper draft of this boat, coupled with thick silt at the end of the dock, meant the boat couldn't get fully into position. With it tugged in as far as it would go, the crane managed to manoeuvre over the hatch and once again began the lift-out process. But whereas Tixall has a dedicated lift ring on top of the boiler, like a tow ring on a car bumper, Emily Ann's boiler needs a steel rod pushed through the centre hole onto which a chain can be bolted. It didn't help that the silt had resulted in the boat lying at an angle on the mud, which meant the hatch hole was not level. To avoid banging the boiler on the edge, the crane had to move a few inches further along. It was a close thing, but thanks to the skill of the crane operator, the boiler came out without a snag. And as before, the crane edged it forward over the top of the boat towards Matthew's trailer. At last, both boilers were down and secured, and Matthew could drive them home for their refurbishment. Three weeks later, I went up to Dan's workshop. The restoration involves taking the tubes out of the boilers and replacing them with new ones. But it turns out the way the tubes hold against the force of all the high-pressure steam is not quite what you might expect.
These tubes aren't welded in, they're merely expanded in with a thing called a tube expander. It's like a roller bearing with a tapered wedge on the top, which drives itself into the tube and forces the tube out onto the tube plate. And that is all that is keeping the tubes in place.
Even with all the pressure of the...
Yeah. The traction engines are the same, most steamboats are the same. It's a 200-year-old method which seems to just work brilliantly.
Unfortunately, that technique, along with the accumulation of 20 years' worth of limescale, rubbish and grot, had pretty much glued the tubes in place. So to remove them, the tube ends first had to be ground flush. Once ground, each tube was heated with an oxyacetylene torch and then rapidly cooled with water. The sudden change in temperature from red hot to cold made the tubes shrink quickly, which cracked them away from the boiler end plate. In theory, this loosened them enough that they could then be pulled out. The idea is that with the old tubes gone and new ones inserted, the boiler can be recertified by an inspector.
Any steam-powered machine, be it traction engine, railway locomotive, stationary engine or boats, they all have to have boiler tests by approved boiler inspectors. 1 litre of water can create about 2,000 litres of steam. And that boiler can hold just over 200 litres of water. That's a lot of steam it can generate. So if the boiler was to fail, it would literally be like a bomb going off. These steam engines are very dangerous if things go wrong. The boiler examiner is there every year to come and check the boiler, make sure that the safety features are working, like the safety valves. Some boilers have things called fusible plugs in them, which are designed to melt before the top of the firebox melts. It's sort of a last case scenario to chuck water on the fire to put the fire out. It's mainly there to see that the modes of putting water into the boiler are working properly, the pressure gauges are all calibrated, to test mainly that the safety valves go off and the pressure doesn't keep climbing if they are going off. It's called an accumulation test. Worst case scenario is you've got a massive fire, you can't get it out of the boiler, and the safety valves can't keep up with the amount of steam being generated. So that scenario is played out every year by the boiler inspector.
Removing the tubes once they'd been loosened should have been straightforward. A hydraulic puller was attached to each tube, bracing itself against the tube plate. It's a bit like pulling something with your hands but bracing yourself with your legs, but this device has a couple of tons of force. It shows just how strong the pressure-fit method of construction was that even these ancient tubes were so solidly in place. And there were some that buckled as they were pulled, which caused major headaches.
We had to get an oxyacetylene gun, cut the tube, let the tube drop into the boiler, and sort of forget about that for now. We'll have to get all the rest of the tubes out, so we've got room to take that out. We then had to chop the tube up into tiny little pieces inside the boiler barrel and then feed the little pieces through the tube plate holes. It's a really tedious and soul-destroying process.
With each of the 51 tubes in Tixall's boiler taking about an hour to remove, and then there were all Emily Ann's to do too, I left the chaps to it.
Starting to go just here. Look, see where all the scale.
4 months later, yes, months, and I headed up to Lymm near Manchester for the annual Canal Festival, featuring boats like this historic craft with its distinctive Bolinder engine. I've never understood why they sound like that, but you always know when one's coming. And there amongst the narrowboats, having made its way there under, quite literally, its own steam, was Tixall. Peer closely through the side hatch and you can see the boiler reinstalled.
Refitting was slightly more difficult because we had to line the boiler up with the 3 bolt holes, and on a rocking boat. We did it next to a place called King's Lock, which as soon as someone let the lock down, the boat's going everywhere, and you know, the law of sod did state that the minute the boiler was about to come down, someone let the lock down. It was a little bit interesting. I mean, we got one bolt in and we were able to crowbar the boiler around a little bit, and then once we got 2 bolts in, the third one went straight in.
But there's been a huge change, which was always part of the plan. The coal burner has been replaced with an oil-fired system, at the time of filming held on with temporary straps just until it could be fixed properly in place. So, why?
Coal these days is just so difficult to come by, real coal. And we used to burn Welsh steam coal, which was smokeless, more or less. Last year, for a portion of the year, especially when you did the video with us, we were burning a mixture of like South African, Russian, all sorts of stuff, which was smoky. It wasn't very nice to breathe in. We were getting grief from other people about the smoke. And I mean the price as well, the price of coal has just gone through the roof. So we thought, we need to go down a different avenue. And I'd been talking with a few people from the Steamboat Association, and they said, why don't you try oil? So we decided to go with a Riello burner, a central heating burner. They run off 240 volts, but they're very, very low on their energy usage. And the good thing with that is it's either on or it's off. So when we're in a lock, the burner can be off, and the safety valves don't have to be blowing off all day. So we're saving water. It's also smokeless. There's no ash, there's no soot, there's no clinker in the morning, and we can run the burner off my phone. So if we've got a really early start, I can steam the boat up from my bed.
And the oil burner running on kerosene is much cheaper than coal.
So in fuel to get here from Middlewich, it's cost us about £15, which, considering we used to be running at about £70 a day on coal, down to £15 every 2 days, you know, it's just an absolutely phenomenal decrease in cost. But it means we can do more events now. We can do more events, we can go further afield, and we don't have to worry about the cost. We're still in the experimenting stage. We're going to try running slightly heavier oil and maybe less kerosene and see how the burner runs, or more kerosene. We're going to be doing a bit of experimentation to see if the burner runs better on different mixes. We've also considered putting a steam coil in the fuel tank. So if we're running on pure waste oil, we can heat it up to about 40 degrees before it goes into the burner, and then it will be the consistency of diesel. So we've been thinking about a lot of things, but for now, just to play it safe, we're watering down the oil a little bit. Yeah.
The boiler's not the only new thing on the boat. Matthew's added an extra steam horn too, which has a splendid sound. Emily Ann has taken longer to fix, but it's hoped to be going again by March, when both will be blowing the trumpet for steamboat heritage. Thanks for watching. Cheerio.